Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history, a war of gods and men. Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, Moses against the gods of Egypt, and other supernatural historical novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, Joan Didion once wrote. But maybe we tell stories because otherwise the darkness starts talking back. I've been thinking about temples lately. Not the ones you build with stone, but the kind that whisper across time. The ones buried under layers of myth and blood, sealed beneath concrete slabs of secular history. The kind that flicker behind your eyelids when you're half asleep, halfway between Genesis and some ancient worn, torn rune that never made the textbooks. Today I want to talk about one of those temples, and about a man named Judah Maccabee. But more than that, I want to talk about the war behind the war most people never see, the one fought in dreams, symbols, and the morrow of stories. Because somewhere between the ancient world and the modern lie the broken bones of forgotten gods. And our guest, well, he's been digging them up with a pen. His latest book, Judah Maccabee Part 1, Abomination of Desolation, isn't just historical fiction. It's a theological excavation, a mythopoetic time machine, if you will. A sword raised not just against empire, but against the principalities behind them. And it all starts here, with the desecration of the temple. There's something eerie about the idea that every empire eventually writes its own book of Revelation. It always starts the same way: a king, a conquest, a promise of peace, and ends in flames. Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who defiled the temple in Jerusalem, isn't just a madman. He's this puppet strung up by darker things, by these spirits older than pyramids, crouching behind Greek statuary. He wears the face of a tyrant, but speaks with the voice of Olympus. And maybe something even older than that. And Judah Maccabee? He's no mere resistance fighter. He's a mythic echo, a hammer of God and flesh, caught between the weight of legacy and the strange call of the divine. He bleeds, he doubts, he dreams. But when the sacred is trampled, he doesn't give up. And that's the difference between history and story. History tells you what happened. Story tells you what it means. And meaning these days is in short supply. I've seen it said that stories are lies we tell to get at the truth. Well, that's not quite right. Stories are like stars. You never see them in the light, but when the world goes dark, they're still there, guiding you home if you know how to read them. In the days of temple fires and marble gods, people didn't read stories, they breathed them. They built cities around them, shaped laws for them, died for them. Back then, a name wasn't just a name. It was a spell, a story condensed in a single breath. Take the temple in Jerusalem. Not the architectural blueprint, but the story I told. It said, Here is where heaven kisses earth. Here is where the Creator carved out sacred space inside the madness of men. And when Antiochus defiled that temple, when pigs bled on the altar and statues of Zeus replaced the Holy of Holies, it wasn't a mere war crime. It was a narrative attack, a hostile rewrite, a cosmic act of gaslighting. That's what tyranny always tries to do, hijack the story. I want to tell you another story. It's old. You've heard it before, though maybe not in this way. A kingdom rises. A strange king takes the throne, one who calls himself divine. He outlaws prayer. He enforces assimilation. He replaces your holy days with state festivals, your sacred scrolls with imperial propaganda. The people tremble. Some go along. Some fight back. But in the hills, quiet, ragged, dangerous, one man remembers. He remembers the old songs, the laws written in fire, the promises etched in blood and stone. He lights a candle. He picks up a sword. He becomes the story again. It's not a new story. It's the old one, awakened, the one buried deep in the bones of his people. What I'm saying is this. Every generation must remember what the story is before someone else rewrites it. We've been trained to believe stories are distraction, Netflix noise, fantasy fluff, Marvel-branded mythology for the consumer class. But that's camouflage. That's how the enemy hides. Because if you bury a story deep enough, it becomes myth. If you bury it deeper, it becomes memory. And when memory dies, the shadows come in. There's a reason our ancestors didn't fight with logic alone. They fought with names, songs, symbols. When they stood before armies, they didn't just raise weapons. They raised their stories. Our God brought us out of Egypt. The mountain shook when he spoke. The temple is holy. The land is ours. The covenant still stands. These aren't mere claims. They're narrative declarations. Truths too dangerous to let live unless you fear the author. Maybe that's why temples are always the first to burn. Not because they're military targets, but because they remind people they belong to a bigger story. There's a passage in the book of Daniel that bothers me a little bit. It's not the fiery furnace or the lion's den. It's this. The watchers came down, and the holy ones spoke judgment. Not men, not prophets. Watchers, holy ones. Entities who preside not over nations, but over the unfolding story itself. They seem to be entities who preside over nations. But they're more than that. It's like they stand over the unfolding of the story itself. Daniel saw it. Enoch wrote about it. And then the world forgot. But maybe forgetting was the point, because when the Watchers fell, when they crossed into our world and offered forbidden knowledge, they didn't just break heaven's laws. They rewrote the story. They taught us how to weaponize wonder, how to enslave imagination. They taught us that the stars weren't signs but destinations, that the temple was just a building, that stories were just lies with better pacing. They taught us that nothing is sacred unless you can monetize it. And the moment we believed them, really believed them, was the moment the story began to die. But here's the thing about stories. They never really do die. They wait in the margins, in the old songs and flickering candles, and the moment your child asks, was it true? They wait in the bones of martyrs and the dust of burned scrolls. They wait for someone to remember. for someone to pick up the thread again. And when they return, they come roaring, stranger and older and more dangerous than before, because now they've crossed through fire. Now they've been tested. Now they've seen what happens when the temple burns and the world shrugs. You think this is just about ancient wars and forgotten gods. It's not. It's about what happens when people forget how to dream with purpose. When the sacred becomes entertainment and resistance becomes a brand name. When the stories you tell yourself are no longer yours but someone else's script. That's when the abomination rises again. Not in temples. Sometimes in algorithms, occasionally in classrooms, more often than not, in your own mind. So, today, as the world spins quietly into its next forgetful revolution, ask yourself something. What story are you living inside? And who wrote it? Welcome, everyone, to an extraordinary episode where we journey into the intersection of history, spirituality, and the supernatural. Today we're diving into a story that resonates through the ages, a story of faith, courage, and divine intervention. We're exploring the life and times of Judas Maccabeus, a pivotal figure in the history of Israel, whose legacy is marked by rebellion against oppression and unwavering devotion to God. But this isn't just a history lesson. We're going deeper into the spiritual forces at work, the supernatural undercurrents that shape these events, and the profound lessons they hold for us today. Brian Godawa, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
You're welcome. And today we're going to be talking about your new book about Judas Maccabeus, part one of the Abomination of Desolation series in your Chronicles of the Watchers.
Actually, it's a two-part novel set. Two parts, and it's called Judah Maccabee, and the first part is subtitled Abomination of Desolation, and the second one is titled Against the Gods of Greece. And so this is the fourth and fifth novel in my series, Chronicles of the Watchers. And it's one of the first. It's one of the few stories where I needed two novels to tell the story. You know, I mean, obviously I have series, but each book within the series is its own story focused on one major character: Noah, Abraham, David, that kind of thing. And this one, even though it's not a biblical book technically, it's the story was so fascinating that I just entered into it and let it go, and it ended up being 2 volumes. So that's fine with me. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's an interesting point to make, that it's not technically a biblical book, because the stories of the Maccabees we find it recorded in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament scriptures, but also the Jewish tradition of Hanukkah comes from that story.
Yeah, so I pitch it as the supernatural story of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is one of two festivals in Judaism that are technically not biblically commanded, but they do, they commemorate historical instances. The first one's Purim, which celebrates, Esther, which is in the Bible, but the festival wasn't, right? So, but they celebrate that victory over Haman. Was it? Yeah, Haman. And then this one, which is the Festival of Lights or Festival of Hanukkah. What's interesting about that was in my series Chronicles of the Watchers, I'm retelling stories, mostly Bible stories, but they don't have to be. Like, they may expand in the future into other nations like Great Britain or something. But I sort of started out focusing heavily on the Middle East and Israel and some of those stories. And they have to do with the Watchers and this biblical notion that I carry through in all my series that has to do with the ancient biblical understanding that at the time of Babel, in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10 talks about this. At the time of Tower of Babel, when God separated the nations, he placed the Gentile nations who did not serve him. He placed them under the authority of these sons of God, these fallen divine beings, right? And but then he said, Jacob, I keep for myself. They will be mine. So that's sort of what they call territorial spirits over the nations and over cities and earthly authorities. The concept was that there were heavenly authorities that were linked to them. So if there was a battle on earth, there would be a battle going on in heaven as well. And this comes out in many places in the Bible. Of course, the classic passage is in Daniel 10, right, where we know that he excuse me, Daniel. Hold on a second here. Sorry about that. Have some throat things going on. So in the book of Daniel, chapter 10, we know that the historical context of Daniel is talking about the 4 Gentile kingdoms that would ultimately rule over Israel or God's people. And Daniel, of course, lived through the first 2 of them, right, in that Babylon and under Nebuchadnezzar, and then the Medes and the Persians. And where was I going with this? Oh, sorry. But then after the Medes and the Persians, Alexander the Great would come and conquer the known world and take the power away from the Medes and the Persians. And so Daniel is referencing that when he talks about a vision that he has, and he talks to Gabriel, the archangel, and he also talks to what some people think it may actually be Jesus in a pre-incarnate appearance. But nonetheless, he talks about how the Prince of Persia is fighting against the Prince of Greece. And that word for prince in Hebrew is very clearly a spiritual principality. Most all scholars agree on that. So they're not earthly. But of course, it corresponds to the earthly, what's going on in the earthly realm, right? In terms of the Greek was preparing to start to come and take over the world and take it away from the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel talks, very explicitly expresses that concept that the Gentile nations are not under God's authority. They're under the authority of these other sons of God. And my premise in my series is, what if the gods of the ancient world, we know that pagans worshipped, Greeks worshipped Zeus and Hera and Poseidon, and then, the Egyptians worshipped Horus and Ra and all those, their Egyptian deities, and Canaanites, of course, worshipped Baal and Asherah. And a lot of these characters show up, these gods show up in the Bible. But my premise of my series is, what if the gods of the ancient world were real? Not in the sense of like the way that the myths have them, but that they were expressions of a demonic reality. And the Deuteronomy also talks about, I think it's Deuteronomy 32. 17 or somewhere around there, Moses talks about how the gods of Canaan that the Israelites worshipped, it says they worshipped the gods of Canaan, they worshipped demons. And so my premise is, what if these gods in the ancient world are based on some kind of real entities? Is it a one-to-one correspondence? No, I don't think so. But just the idea is these deceiving deities want to get people to worship them and not the living God, and so they inspire these various mythologies and such. And so they're real fallen angels is basically the premise of it, right? And that's what all my series, Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and Chronicles of the Watchers are all about that premise and how that works its way out until Jesus comes as Messiah. And so I have that paradigm as well in this story. And you mentioned Judas Maccabeus. That's if you read the Septuagint, the name is going to be spelled out that way. My book is called Judah Maccabee because that's the Hebrew, the English translation of the Hebrew. And when you're reading when you're reading the books of the Maccabees, they're in the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation, but also it's talking about a time period where Hellenism, or the Greekification, I like to call it, of the world, Greek was a very world power. And so it's called Hellenism, right? And so this is post Alexander the Great. Hellenism is, it's taken over their known world, right? When I say the world, in their ancient mindset, it was their known world, right? So, and Rome is actually on the ascendant. Rome is a republic, but its power is growing and about to overcome and overtake the Greek kingdom. So anyway, but Hellenism is this word that we've heard before that talks about the power and influence that Alexander the Great had by conquering the world, and he made them all to speak Greek so they would have one economic language, a lingua franca, and it really did aid in unifying the world. Unfortunately, it was unifying the world under Greco, worldview and such. And so a lot of cultures took to it because it was a very, powerful, beautiful culture, right? They had a lot of beautiful arts and culture, et cetera. But of course, the Jews had their own unique religion and unique culture. And it was very, in fact, most of the other pagan religions were okay with, we'll worship the Greek gods too, sure. Well, and Greek would say, okay, you can worship your gods, but also worship our gods, that kind of a thing, And Rome, of course, took that to its height as well. You can have your gods, but as long as you sacrifice to Caesar. And the Greeks were very similar to that, but the Jews just could not abide. They're, of course, monotheists. And interestingly, that had always been a sticking point, but Antiochus the Great, who was the king of the Hellenistic kingdom before this time period that I'm writing, he actually he made a deal with the Jews. He would let them go ahead and engage in their special religious separations. So in other words, circumcision, Sabbaths, their dietary taboos, all these things that separated them from the Greek culture, they were allowed. And so they got along fine until this time period. And the story takes place, there's so many paths I can go down, there's the whole thing of, before I even launch into the story, as a Christian, of course, I believe the Bible is God's word. And what's interesting is that many Christians don't know. They may know their Bibles, they may memorize scriptures and such, but they don't know a lot about the Bible. And sadly, that's why a lot of Christians end up losing their faith when they get confronted with some very powerful arguments by unbelievers like Bart Ehrman. And a lot of it's true. There are a lot of problems with textual transmission of the Bible. And when they finally have to face these things, they've been taught this false picture of what the Bible is, and so they often lose their faith. And one of those components is the fact that the translations that we have of our current Bible have two traditions, the Greek and the Hebrew. And many people assume, well, the Hebrew must be the original translation because that's the original language of the Jews, and that's what they originally wrote it in. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily 100% true, because the Hebrew that we're reading only goes back to about 600 AD, or maybe a little bit earlier than that. But that's way long after the the Christians actually started growing, and the Christians actually, because their commitment with the first century Jews was to the Greek translation. Because of the Hellenism, around 252 AD BC, Ptolemy Philadelphus II was the Greek king over Egypt, and he basically brought in a bunch of, he's the one who was part of building the original Library of Alexandria, which became the famous library of the ancient world, and unfortunately was burned down. But he wanted to have the scriptures in Greek, right? And so he brought in, there's legends about it, but nonetheless, he brought in a bunch of Hebrew scholars to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Now, they only did the Pentateuch at first, the first 5 books. But eventually, over the next 100 years, they ended up translating all the rest of the texts that we know as the Old Testament. So this is when people say the word Septuagint, what they're referring to is a reference to, Septuagint means 70, and that's the translation of the 70, meaning 70 scholars who translated it. And that's the Latin word, Septuagint, right? But it basically refers to the Greek translation of the Bible. And what's in that, and what we have of that text are codexes that go back to like 400 AD. And in those codexes, which are bound books, we have both the Old and New Testaments, and we have what's called the Apocrypha. So it was the early church and early Christians who actually included the Apocrypha in their Bibles or in their canon lists. But then we do know, there's of course the debates in history where the things were debated and ultimately they were not considered to be included. And I support that because, if you look at the ancient Hebrew canon lists or references, they're never referred to as scripture. But they were always throughout the historic Christian church, even into the Reformation, they were always accepted as helpful, instructional, spiritual materials and historical materials. Not perfect history, but of course, historical and cultural materials. And so even so much so that the Roman Catholics included in their Bible, and they call it the deuterocanonical scriptures, which is sort of like, well, it's not quite fully canonical, but it's not canonical. So it's deuterocanonical, the second canon. Yeah. But then also the Eastern Orthodox also includes these apocryphal books as well. And there's variations on it, but nonetheless, First and Second Maccabees are a couple of those books that are in that text. Now, even as a Christian, so my conclusion is I don't think it's scripture, but one of the big problems with a lot of in the evangelical world, which is where I come from, there's a real ignorance of anything outside of the Bible and a rejection as if like the Bible's all I need and I don't need anything else to learn anything else. And and so there's a dismissive nature towards this. But like I said, my interest is in history, and these books are written about a time period which is silent in the Bible. So you've got the last prophet Malachi, about 400 BC, and then there's no prophets in Israel, and God does not speak to Israel. And in 586 BC, Ezekiel says he saw the Spirit of God leave the temple, and he never came back until Messiah, right? So that's 400 years, what they call 400 years of silence. And the Maccabees story happens within that 400 years of silence. I find that fascinating, interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I was curious. It's a great story. It's very similar to Braveheart, and we can, I could talk a little bit about that. But yeah, I mean, it really is, and I love it so much. And Braveheart's my favorite movie. So, but I know that it's a famous story about how. Let's see if I don't want to get off the topic too much. But so yeah, there's the Septuagint part. Then there's the component of, even if it's not scriptural, there is a lot of scholarly, arguments for the fact that what happens in the book of Maccabees is actually a fulfillment of some of Daniel's prophecies. And we can go into that. But so to me, that's what makes it very interesting and very worthy to be in my series, how connected it is to the Bible, fulfilling Daniel's prophecies and such. But also, the historical side of it was very fascinating to me. And there's so many aspects to it that all connects in. And when people read my novels, they often find that they're all sort of interwoven with each other, but theologically and all that. But so the story, though, itself is basically what happens is the Jews have had for 50 odd years or so, they've had the freedom to sort of exercise their religion without being oppressed, basically, right? And then what happens is, though, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he became king around I think it's like 178 BC or something like that. But by the time of 168 BC, that's when my story begins. And Antiochus Epiphanes is a cruel and wicked king towards the Jews. But what happens is he doesn't start out that way. He's actually the king of the Seleucid Greek kingdom, which is rooted in Syria, but it expands over into Mesopotamia and such. So he's the ruler of that. Meanwhile, down in the south, in Egypt, the Ptolemies are also Greek rulers, and they have been at odds with each other. And so they've been engaged in wars, and they're actually six Syrian wars back and forth between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies that ends up being prophesied in Daniel 11. So it's that's a fascinating time. Anyway, so Antiochus Epiphanes so he owns the Levant area, and he owns Israel, Judah, and he goes down to Egypt because he's been, having just so many problems with Egypt and battles, and he finally has enough power to go down there once for all, sort of take it over. But unfortunately, Rome is ascending in power at that time, and they put their foot down and say, nope, if you do this, if you attack them, after he's already been there and besieging the city of Alexandria, Egypt, then the Romans step in and say, if you do this, you will be at odds with us and you will be at war. And he knows better. So he ends up, going home, But on his way back, he hears about a civil unrest in the city of Jerusalem. And it's like, what are these people, what's going on here? And he's under the impression that they are rebelling against him. But what's actually kind of going on is there's a civil war going on for control of the city between various high priests, two different high priests, both of whom are corrupt and both of whom are not legitimate high priests. But Antiochus Epiphanes, as the king over Israel, chose the high priest because he was bribed, right? And that high priest's name was Menelaus. So Menelaus is causing all these problems, but it ends up being a civil war. So he thinks it's an uprising against him. So he goes over to Israel for a second time. The first time was like a year ago, and he had pillaged the temple and took all the gold and stuff. But this time he goes to stomp down, right? And he gets so angry with the Jews and his beliefs about what they are he goes there, he kills a bunch of them with his generals, and he says, okay, no more of this special treatment for Jews. You must become Hellenized, and you must now reject your special religious exemptions. So you cannot get circumcised, you cannot obey Sabbath, and you have to eat pork and all these meats that you won't eat. And what's more is he sets up an image of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, and they're supposed to sacrifice to that. So that image is what is referred to in the book of Daniel as the Abomination of Desolation. And what that means is, abomination is simply a word that is in the Bible. It refers to images of gods that are abominable to Yahweh, right? So it's just abomination is simply an image that is abominable to God. And then desolation is not like destruction per se. It's I think it's more a reference to the fact that it makes its presence makes God withdraw his presence, right? I'm a jealous God. I'm not going to allow this in my presence. So I will leave. So if you put an image in my temple, I'm gone, type of thing. So it's desolation and spiritual desolation for the nation, that kind of a thing. So that's what that term means. Now, I know your listeners, prophecy out there today is a big thing, and there's all kinds of views out there. And I know they're thinking, well, abomination of desolation. Wait a minute. Now, just real quickly, there are different theories about the abomination of desolation, and most of them do acknowledge that there a couple references in Daniel are to this image that Antiochus Epiphanes puts up. But then people say, well, what Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, Daniel spoke. So that's a different abomination. Yeah, there is one future to Jesus's day. Absolutely. But here's how it works. If you look, I did a study, and I actually put an appendix at the back of the second novel to explain all this theologically. But so there's 4 basic places in Daniel that talk about the abomination of desolation. And in short, there are 2 abominations of desolation that are prophesied. It's not one that then just repeats itself in history arbitrarily, and anybody can say, but it is a generic term. Abomination of desolation could refer to any image that is in a holy place that shouldn't be there. So it's a generic phrase, so to speak, right? But in terms of the prophecies, if you look at Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, those are prophecies referring to this time period of the Maccabees. And then when it talks about another abomination in chapters 9 and 12, that's a future one that Jesus talked about, right? And so, and the way you know this is the abomination in 8 and 11 talks about being desolate. It brings desolation to the temple, which is, right, the lack of the presence of God or spiritual desolation, but not destruction. But the abomination spoken of in 9 and 12 actually brings the destruction of the temple and the sanctuary, and the temple and the city. And so we know that anyway, so there's 2 very different ones in history. So you can put that future one aside. I'm not addressing that one. I'm addressing this one that occurs in the days of the Maccabees, right? So that's the kind of scenario that sets up. Then many Jews go along with it because many Jews had been Hellenized, and they're willing to compromise, basically, right? But then some of them did not, and they're called the Hasidim, and these were just holy ones. In other words, the Jews that would not do it. They're not going to eat pork. They're not going to stop circumcising and all that. And of course, what happens is because they refuse to obey the king then sets out and kills them, a bunch of them, martyrs them. In fact, there's a famous passage in Maccabees that talks about highly descriptive of the torture of this woman and her 7 sons because they would not eat pork. And it describes their torturing scenes, as well as an old scribe named Eleazar. I have all those characters in my novel, and I have those scenes in my novel. It's a very brutal turning point, but it is a turning point because that martyrdom becomes an inspiration for Judah Maccabee and his brothers and their father to rise up and begin a revolt. So what happens is Judah Maccabee, he comes from a priestly family. His father was named Mattathiah, and Mattathiah was the leader of the family. Judah ended up becoming the general when his father died, but his father had these 5 sons, and Judah was one of them, and he was a very strong leader. And so what happens is they finally rise up and say, no more, we're not going to go along with this as well. And they end up, when the Greeks come into their little town outside of Jerusalem called Modian, they try to force the town to sacrifice on an altar of Zeus. This is what they were doing. They were going around and forcing the Jews to violate their religion, right? And they said nope, and they ended up killing all the Greeks, led by Mattathiah, the father, and Judah and his brothers. And then, of course, they run out into the wilderness and they become guerrilla fighters. And from that point on, they have to grow their army to become a force that would ultimately end up returning and kicking the Greek king out of Israel and away from the temple so that they could get the temple back and cleanse it, destroy the abomination, desolation, cleanse the temple, and restart the sacrifices. And so that's the story of Hanukkah that celebrates their cleansing of the temple, right? So I tell that whole storyline throughout these two books, and I go into the main characters are Judah, and he has love interests, a wife, and his father and his brothers, and each of them have varying ambitions that they are involved with in the story. And I also have this supernatural storyline going on at the same time. I say, okay, what might it look like in the spiritual realm while all these historical things are going on? And so I have the gods of Greece, Zeus and Apollo and these guys, who are demonic watchers, who are authorities over Greece, but they are in the land of Israel because the Greek kingdom is there, right? And actually, incidentally, meanwhile, Rome is actually taking over the mainland of Greece, so they're kind of on their own, right? And they're away from home, shall we say, right? And then, of course, when Antiochus goes down to Egypt and goes to fight, the gods of Egypt also rise up and battle with the gods of Greece, and then ultimately, in my stories, I usually have the archangels of God as the protectors of Israel and the protectors of the line of Messiah, the bloodline of Messiah, because that's what all my stories are all about, is what I call the war of the seed. And that is the prophecy going all the way back to Genesis 3, where God says, I will put enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve, meaning, the followers of Satan and the followers of God, basically, right? And so, he will strike your heel and you will crush his head. And the idea there is that Satan seeks to stop the bloodline of Messiah so that he cannot come, right? And all my stories sort of ultimately are focused on that one big goal. And that's the big picture of the whole novel set and a little bit of the theology behind it. But my main purpose, I come out of Hollywood as a screenwriter, and my goal is to have, it's got to be an entertaining story or I'm not going to write it. So my goal is I do try to retell Bible stories, but I try to do so in a way that's entertaining and not a preachy sort of thing, if that makes sense.
No, that makes great sense. Something that I had learned while studying literature, or learning how to read literature specifically in some college courses, was looking at a book, not merely as the story was presented, but looking at some of the information that may be deeper in there and kind of pulling out some of the ideas or maybe even modern day parallels. And I'd like to kind of do that for a second here with you. And specifically, when we're looking at someone like the oppressive regime under Antiochus, that guy.
Yeah, Antiochus Epiphanes.
You got Mr. Epiphanes.
What a name.
Right. The fourth.
You can call him Epiphanes.
Yeah. So we've got Antiochus the Fourth, and I'm just curious, do you see any of these parallels between his oppressive regime and modern systems that seek to suppress religious expression?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. Although it's interesting because, the Christian tradition has always been against revolution. And so versus wars of independence, or to put it in its most basic Christian concept of understanding, is we are to obey our civil authorities over us, even if they're oppressive. We are to obey them and not rise up against them. The only time that you are allowed to do so is if it commands you to disobey God. So if the state allows abortion, it's not forcing you to have abortion, right? So even though that's evil and we must fight against it, but we have to do so legally. And it wouldn't be appropriate for us to go out and murder people who are aborting their babies, even though they may deserve execution by the state, but our state doesn't accept that. On the other hand, though, if the state forces you to say, for instance, you can't meet in your church because of COVID, right? A lot of churches bowed to that. But some didn't. Some stood up and said, no, God commands us to keep meeting together and we will meet together, Now, of course, they weren't violent about it, but you can see where back in the ancient days with a much more brutal world as well, these Jews, the very essence of their religion was attacked, specifically told not just to not obey your religion, but to disobey God and violate it in every way. So from a Christian perspective, the Maccabees had, in my understanding, a justified right to rise up and revolt. However, that's not the same as the way most people today think is, so therefore, if we got an oppressive government, we should rise up. No, revolution is not biblical. Revolution is you disagree with the government, and so the people rise up and just overthrow it. That's revolution. But when you have a proper war for independence, like the American War for Independence, it technically wasn't a revolution because we had local magistrates who we were under authority, and it was the local magistrates who were defying the king because of it was a definition of authority there, right? Also in Maccabees, the main essence is, they're literally told to do the very things that God says. Some of the things God said would require, like the idolatry and stuff, that was under capital punishment, right? So for the Maccabees to violently stand against that, it was, in my opinion, it was a just biblical war, not so much a revolution as it was a war for independence.
Yeah, you spoke a bit about the cultural influences too. So not only did we have basically Hellenism, we also have this the Seleucid Empire, right? At the time, this is really where the massive cultural clash happens. And how would the story, basically I'm asking you, how does the story of Judah Maccabee challenge or even encourage people navigating cultural pressures today?
Yeah, well, definitely by way of analogy, because as a Christian, we are under the New Covenant, and New Covenant changes a lot of things. It transforms the Old Covenant, right? It actually it abrogates the Old Covenant. It does away with it and replaces it with a new covenant. And so there were many things under the Old Covenant that would not be acceptable today. So, for example, the classic thing, which is the argument against Christians and Jews, the holy wars of, they went and they killed all the people in Canaan, Well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but nonetheless, the bottom line is well, yeah, if you don't believe there's a God, then you believe that any claim that God is telling us to kill people must be obviously a false claim, and people are just wanting to genocide people. No, if there is a God, and there is, and he actually does determine right and wrong, and he's the one that determines these people do not deserve to be in that land, they have every right to do what God tells them to do. But those holy wars were based on this paradigm that I mentioned about the Watchers, meaning these Gentile nations had other authorities, and they were in the land of Canaan, which God claimed as his own. And God's the creator, and he can do whatever he wants. So if you don't like that, that's your problem. And it's not a moral problem. It's not a logical problem. It's your problem because you just don't like it. And I don't care what some puny human thinks. If God tells them that's their land and they have to take it from them, right? So there is a violence. There's a war a holy war for taking land for God's people in that day. But the thing is, with the coming of the new covenant, the violence of that older covenant in that more violent world, that's done away with, because now, what happens is when Messiah came, he actually took the authority of all those nations, took it back. It's like he disinherited them from the nations. Why? It's because God was going to draw people from every tongue, every tribe, and every nation into the kingdom of God, which is the new covenant kingdom, right? No longer is there a holy land. All the earth is the Lord's, right? And people from every tribe and nation in every so you can't say one nation is holy or not, because there are Christians in every nation. There's no more holy land. There's no more physical wars that are done in the name of God, etc. Now, that, of course, there's still just wars, to fight for defense or to fight to protect the people from evil, etc. But this notion of the religious wars and stuff, that's done away with the new covenant. And so, but that doesn't mean we can't draw analogies. And in fact, that's what Paul does in the New Testament. He talks about how, he refers to, for instance, he'll refer to, I think it's in Corinthians, where he talks about how he uses the language that was used in the Old Testament of executing idolaters, right? But he doesn't say to execute them. He uses that concept, but he talks about how you are to excommunicate them. Basically, you are to cut them off, send them away from the church. People who are idolaters, you must send them away. You can't kill them like you used to in the Old Testament, but you should cut them off from the church. So that's the analogy. That's the spiritual analogy, which is why, what is he? I can't remember exactly where it is, but where he talks about the eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? And he talks about how he says that the temple of God has nothing in common with the temple of demons, right? And these are demonic beings, but he doesn't say to execute the people who do that, right? He says instead to, like I said, to cut them off spiritually. So I think we can draw analogies of compromise for sure in today's world. But the analogy now is more on the moral level of between immoralities, sexual morality, whatever, greed, lust, and all that kind of stuff. Those are things that are the equivalent of idolatry. Paul even says that, right? Greed and such and lust, which is idolatry. And so, so now we have a more spiritual reality that we're wrestling with, rather than a physical reality of wars, which is why Jesus said, he said, the kingdom of God is within you. It's not here or there. It's not an earthly, it's a spiritual kingdom. It's yes, it has a spiritual kingdom that has earthly consequences, but it's not an earthly kingdom like it was in the old covenant, right? And the new covenant, it's a spiritual kingdom that ends up, obviously growing to be the biggest tree in the garden, right? A little bit of leaven that leavens the whole lump of dough, which is all the world. So its influence now is through conversion. And so, whereas in the old covenant, God would conquer pagan peoples, but now he conquers pagans through conversion. And so this is why Christianity is not it's not a violent religion. It doesn't mean it doesn't believe in self-defense. It doesn't mean that we can't be soldiers and cops, because that's a different aspect of our social behavior. But in terms of this national authorities and powers and stuff like that, now everyone from every tribe and nation can become Christians. So the compromise now is the state forcing us to do things like like I said, like the COVID thing, or if of course we haven't had that kind of extreme that much in America, at least in recent years, right? I mean, there was a time when, with the Roman Catholics and the Protestants where, they would kill each other, if they didn't convert to their side and such. And that would, but that's in deep history for us, right? In terms of modern days, I think it's more about these things like, like you're going to lose your job if you don't get a vaccine. Whatever, the free speech, right? It's like your free speech is being, we've had massive problems, in the past with social media, truly just censoring speech of Christians and conservatives and such, and debanking conservatives just because they're conservative. And, look, not all conservatives are Christians, but the idea here is that free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, these are the things that are guaranteed in our Constitution, but we've been under, for the last 4 years, we've been under a massive amount of oppression. And so never does that justify violent upheaval, but it certainly justifies civil disobedience, which is why you have pro-lifers. But it's interesting because it's interesting to me because you have pro-lifers who will go and they'll just pray in front of clinics and they'll be put in jail. So many of them were just recently pardoned, thank God, because they were under an oppressive regime that threw them in prison just out of their hatred for Christianity and such, but they stayed strong. And the principle now that I think that we have to follow is, it's like the Daniel principle, which is if the government commands you, do not pray, you cannot pray, you still obey God, but that doesn't mean you do it necessarily rebelliously, right? You don't break laws necessarily, but you continue to be faithful, like churches that did meet over COVID. Yeah, they defied the law, but it was based on a higher law of obeying God, right? So the compromise element lies in: are you going to go along with the world, with everything because that's what everyone's doing? Or are you going to stand firm in what God tells you, So, I definitely see a lot of analogies in that sense. But the biggest one is freedom of speech, I think, which has been under attack. And in my opinion, all the freedoms that we have in the Constitution are founded on the freedom of speech. If you don't have freedom of speech, you're going to lose everything else, And if you don't have freedom of arms, then you're going to become slaves. So that was defense against, an evil, oppressive government. That was the thing that keeps an evil government at bay, which is why the first thing they try to do is take away your guns. If you're a fascist government, they go after your guns. They try to get your guns in any way they possibly can, So yeah, so I see analogies, but I wouldn't say that it justifies revolution in any way.
Yeah, the other thing that I appreciate within your Chronicles of the Watchers, for example, is the fact that you explore the influence of the Watchers, as mentioned in Genesis 6 or Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, etc. And I find this an interesting thing to examine because of the cultures of the ancient world. We can take a look at ancient Sumer, who believed that their gods, the Anunnaki and the Apkallu, were literal physical well, the Apkallu were spiritual, but the Anunnaki were literal physical beings, and they had descriptions and they fed them. And there was like clay tablets of recipes for the gods and all these things that are really an interesting thing. And then by the time we get to the Romans or the Romans and the Greeks, the gods are more like allegorical humans, as depraved as humans can be. This is how they act. But the thing is in your stories, you make the Watchers what I define as sinister forces, and sinister forces are those fallen entities and the human beings who cooperate with them. Those are sinister forces, and they're in the world today. And my question involves is how does that concept, we're on the same page with this, but I would like you to answer the question: is how does this concept align specifically with like the biblical worldview, where we look at, God judges these gods in Psalm 82, And how should a Christian really understand the role of the fallen beings in influencing, I could say, biblical events and then into world history as, the canon is resolved?
Yeah. Well, here's where I kind of have a different view from a lot of the people who are into the divine council worldview. And that, of course, was, I would say it was probably made significantly. Yeah, it's made its most significance because of Michael Heiser, who's now passed away, sadly. But he was a significant influence on a lot of us and a lot of people. And now you have whole, huge Facebook groups and stuff talking about this stuff, and watchers and Nephilim and giants and stuff. Now it gets to be, in my opinion, it goes overboard. It becomes obsessive. It becomes conspiracy theories. And I just, it's exhausting and uninteresting, actually, to me in many ways. But that doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just that people will take it to extreme. But one of the components that is most common is this notion of spiritual warfare. And, most people take this paradigm I'm talking about and say, yeah, right. And like Saudi Arabia and Islam, then they have, even today, there must be a spiritual, entity of power over Islam and over Arabia or whatever. And, or Russia or Iran, right? And it's sometimes, I won't deny that certainly they are quite demonic in the way that they behave, right? But I have a different view than what a lot of those people have. They carry that into the modern world and say, yeah, see, and that's why we have spiritual warfare today, just like back then, et cetera, et cetera. And I've written on this in a lot of if you read all my novels, you'll kind of get this coming through it. But I've also written about it in my book, Psalm 82, which, that is one of my favorite, chapters in the Bible. It's sort of a concise passage that describes the paradigm and its conclusion. And if you go there, Psalm 82, talks about God has taken his place in the divine council. Okay, that's God as Elohim has taken his place in the divine council, which is the council of El, and in Hebrew, right? In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And the word for gods is Elohim. It's the same word as the word for Yahweh that they use of Yahweh, but it's a generic term that can be referenced to any gods, right? And but these are obviously not him. These are gods Elohim, who are around him in a council, and he holds judgment. So there's some kind of a judgment court, and he has these divine beings. And, lots of debates have gone on about Genesis 6, 1 through 4, where the sons of God came down to earth. And that's what I think these beings are, because you'll see a little bit later in the passage, it refers to those sons of God in a slightly different way, but the same concept. And the idea there is that God has this heavenly council of these. Okay, so what's the problem? Evangelicals go, wait, there's no multiple gods. There's only one God, monotheism, right? That you can't say polytheism, right? Well, yeah, the Bible is monotheistic, absolutely, but for sure. But we have to examine our own theology and compare it to the Bible. We don't change the Bible to fit our theology. We change our theology to fit the Bible. And if the Bible says there are gods, there are Elohim, gods around God in a council, then we have to adjust our theology to accept that. Yes, it's still monotheism in that there's one true living God who's the creator of all things, and no one, there's no one like him. The Bible says it over and over again, right? No gods. What God is like our God, right? Yahweh is the God of gods. He created all the other gods, right? So it's not polytheism, but it's definitely not the absolute sort of Islamic type monotheism that a lot of evangelicals also hold to, sadly, because they've been infected by this sort of medieval thinking that's and bad translations as well. Anyway, so the idea here is that God's in this council, he calls them Elohim, but he also calls them by another phrase called sons of God or sons of the Most High. but what's their job? He goes, how long will you judge unjustly, show partiality to the wicked, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver the... So these gods are supposed, these are these authorities over these peoples, right? And this is not Israel. He's not talking about Israel here, because at the end of the passage, it's talking about the nations, right? So this isn't Israel. And these aren't human judges that are being referred to metaphorically as, as gods. It's not a metaphor. If you read a couple Psalms later, Psalm 89, he's talking about the similar scenario, but when he expresses it, it clarifies some factors. So Psalm 89:5, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Yahweh, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. There's that assembly again, but now it's a different phrase. It's called the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? And that word, heavenly beings, is actually who among the sons of God? Who among the, let's see, I'm looking at the Hebrew here. Who among the sons of God is like the Lord? These are heavenly beings. These are in the skies. These aren't, human judges on earth that are being referred to as gods, metaphorically, right? It says, a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones and awesome above all who are around him. And then he says, O Lord, God of hosts. Well, that's a phrase to the host is a phrase to his heavenly army of beings. So, so going back to Psalm 82, you can't take Psalms or any passage in the Bible, you can't take it in a vacuum. You've got to understand it's connected to other passages, and sometimes these passages can clarify. But nonetheless, within that passage, the idea is that they're in authority over the people, and they're supposed to rule over them. Like be just, like a ruler would be, like a god would be, right? But they have not done this, right? Which makes sense. The Gentile nations are under these beings who are not doing. They are ruling wickedly. They are not following God's law, right? They're drawing people to worship themselves. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. That phrase, the foundations of the earth being shaken, it's not a literal phrase. That is a covenantal phrase. That's talking about the spiritual reality is so overwhelming because of what these beings are doing. And then he says, I said you are gods, sons of the Most High. There it is, sons of the Most High, El Elyon, sons of God. It's what they call it, synonyms for the same thing. All of you, nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. So these are beings who are called gods by Yahweh himself. But he's saying, because you are rebellious and because you do not follow me, you will die like men. So he's gonna take these otherwise immortal beings, right? And they're not immortal because of their own power. God's the one who keeps everything surviving. So if something is immortal, it's only because God's keeping it alive. But nonetheless, he tells them, I'm going to kill you like I would a human. And of course, human judges, it wouldn't make sense to say you are gods and that yet you will die like men. Well, yeah, they're all going to die like men. So there's no judgment there. But this is actually a judgment. And then the final phrase is sort of the kicker for me. Verse 8, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations. So that's a reference to, I would think that's an oblique reference to the resurrection of Messiah. Arise, the word in the Greek version is the same. Aneste is the same as what Paul talks about. When he draws from the Psalms, he uses that arise as a metaphor, not a metaphor, but as a reference to, a poetic reference to the resurrection of Jesus. And it makes sense in this context because Jesus will judge the land, judge the earth, right? And Jesus inherits the nations. Psalm 2, let me go there quickly. Psalm 2, I've set my king on Zion, the holy hill. Ask of me and I will make the nations your inheritance. You are my son. Today I've begotten you. Ask me and I will make the nations your inheritance. So it's Messiah who inherits the nations. It's Messiah who rises. It's Messiah who judges. So this is a reference to, this is where I differ now from sort of the standard belief that, yeah, these spiritual powers are still around here today. I don't believe they are. I believe they've been judged. And they were judged when Jesus Christ rose from the dead and disinherited the nations and took the power back, and was, the Bible says in Ephesians, he was ascended into heaven and seated at the right hand of God on the throne of David in heaven over all the earth. And so Jesus was crowned king of the universe, king of the earth at his ascension. And so you cannot say then, if Jesus takes back all the nations and is seated and crowned as king over all the earth, you can't say that there are other territorial powers that are still around. No, then Jesus wouldn't be king. It's a gospel issue in my mind, because Jesus is not king if there are kings over other nations in the spiritual realm, right? And so I believe that's when they were judged, was back in the first century when Jesus rose and ascended. It's probably a minority view amongst the people who believe in this, but it's definitely the biblical view in my mind.
No, I mean, I do believe Paul says that these were chained in Tartarus, and we can't get rid of that fact. And
you know what? I'm glad you brought that up.
You're welcome.
One of my favorite verses is Colossians. Oh, come on, people. Okay. Colossians talks about, Jesus in the image of the visible God. By him, all things were created, heaven and earth, and all things through him. And then in chapter 2, verse 15, he's talking about Christ on the cross. The record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands was canceled. So Christ's victory on the cross, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He, Jesus, disarmed the rulers and authorities. And in context, those are spiritual rulers and authorities. He disarmed, that's what I was talking about, disinheriting, disarming completely, and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. Now, this is called, this language of triumph is not just a generic victory language. It's actually a reference to the Roman triumph, which was and the Romans took it from other kings before them. And the idea was, when a king conquered another nation or a city, he would tie up the rulers, the king, of course, and the rulers, and he would drag them through the streets. Now, Rome actually would take them back to Rome and drag them through the streets, drag them or wheel them on carts, whatever, and people would pelt them with stuff. But it drags them through the streets up to the Jupiter Capitolinus, which was the big holy temple for the city of Rome. And then they would sacrifice that king to Jupiter, right? So the concept of triumphal language here is one that fits that Psalm 82, doesn't it? And it's saying Jesus did this already. He disarmed them and triumphed over them, which means he dragged the spiritual principalities through the streets and executed them. And so that's, and there's more passages like Ephesians 6:12, 3:10, Ephesians 4:8 through 9, 2 Corinthians 2:14. This triumphal language and of Jesus's victory over the powers is very clearly in there. So his victory over the powers occurs in the first century. And that's why I believe, look, there is great evil, and I still think there could be demons around, but it's kind of like the generals have all been executed, but the soldiers are still chaos agents in the world. There could still be demons going around the world, but there's no territorial powers because Christ is king, right? And so at best you might have the terrorists, little terrorist demons, right? But so the great evil that we see in this world, I can use the term demonic because it's preternatural. It's greater than just normal evil of what goes on in this world. But we don't need to appeal to demons to explain evil. In fact, if you do, you're kind of, man's losing, you're denigrating. How can I put this? You're taking away man's responsibility. See, because my point is man can do all that evil all by himself. He can commit genocide, mass rape, as goes on, right? We hear about these mass rape gangs and stuff. You don't need demons to do that. Man is that evil. which proves the doctrine of total depravity or original sin, or whatever you want to call it, man's sinful nature. We are so deeply evil that we deserve judgment. And in my mind, the fact all this evil that we see going around, it doesn't need to have demonic source. It comes from who we are, and that's why we deserve to be judged. So, that's how I kind of understand that.
That's good.
Paradigm.
Yeah, sometimes, the truth is that it's not demons, it's us, and people need to come to that realization.
Now, I do believe there might be demon possession nowadays, like I say, but it's the higher territorial powers. Right. Those are the things that have been definitely, I would agree that there might be demonic things going on. I can see that being legitimate.
Right. Yeah, we can't deny spiritual forces are still real, but I think they all have to submit to the power of Christ. So
yeah.
I think that some people can be bothered by things and God can send a spiritual affliction upon us. So
sure,
it's all possible. Well, as we're wrapping up, Brian, I would like to ask, what do we have coming up in the future? Do you have anything else coming out in 2025 that we can look forward to?
Not too early for me to say.
Logic.
Yeah, well, interestingly, thanks for that. Too early for me to say what's going on in 2025. I'm working on something, but I'm not going to talk about it yet. But it'll be the next Watcher book. But I did last year. I took a break from all these Bible novels, and I did write a serial killer thriller.
Right. Yep.
That I call a theological thriller called Cruel Logic, and that you see that behind me there, right?
Yep.
That's not reversed. Is that reversed?
No, it's fine. It's perfect the way it is. No, that's our first interview. It's our first interview, and I'll make sure to put the link for that in the show notes for our show.
Yeah. So, but just to kind of recap on that, I took a break from that because I had this story for so long, and I had to write it, and I did. So, and I do plan on making a series of that of a few other novels. They won't be the same characters, but they'll be the same concept of theological thrillers and stuff. So, yeah. But the next one will definitely be another Watcher one, and it's going to be connected with everything that I've been writing, including the Maccabees and such. So it's going to be cool. I think I was still a few more in that series that I want to get to. But I never say never, because I remember when I first started writing with my first novel, Chronicles of the Nephilim, Noah Primeval, and I thought, wow, there's a lot more to this that goes beyond the Noah story throughout the whole Bible. Yeah. I could get another 3 or 4 novels out of this. And now I'm up to 18 right. or 16.
Dozen.
And it's just like
2 or 3 dozen of these books, absolutely.
Yeah, and
there's a lot there.
Some people have also asked, hey, are you going to do other nations like the, Great Britain and the Nordic and all that kind of stuff? And even Hindu and India, that would be fascinating. How does that come into play? And I've always been curious about that and interested. I might go down that path. The problem with those is that they don't really have contact with
the biblical world.
With the biblical world that this series has sort of really been rooted in. So I don't know, but I still think the concept is true, even in those ancient worlds of India, that there would be spiritual beings and such. So I don't know, maybe I might expand into that or not, but I still have a couple more biblically rooted stories to finish up this Watcher series in.
Fantastic. And then where could people find more of Brian Godawa?
Yeah, well, all my books are exclusively on Amazon in paperback, audiobook, Kindle, large print, hardcover. I try to do everything for all my books, and they're all exclusively there. So you can find all that if you just look at my name and look at my author page. But if you want to go to my website, I do have a lot of free articles and free things, and I have I actually cast my novels, so I have characters for my novels that you can see on my website, and that's Godawa.com, just my name, GODAWA.com. So there's you can find a lot of stuff on me at my website, but just go straight to Amazon for buying the books.
Fantastic. Well, as always, thank you for coming on the show and having a great conversation with me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.